Picking up where we left off, I was busy harvesting the hay bales in the nether. Emerging victorious in the village, I went to collect my glorious bounty and bask in the riches. Of course, this Vespa had to ruin the moment. Back at base, I began preparations to construct an automatic XP farm. At this point, grinding for levels was almost mandatory to max out my armor, and sitting there clicking the left mouse button for 40 minutes wasn't exactly the definition of engaging gameplay. Mobs killed by the saw will drop EXP, so I planned on using this to create an auto kill chamber. Of course, an auto farm demands far more than just the saw, so I prepared enchanting materials, a water wheel for power, and some building blocks for construction purposes. The design was essentially quite simple. An upward facing saw would be powered, kill mobs, and have the drops collected into a storage area. The EXP orbs would then be fed to the player through a mob-proof half-block hole at the bottom of the chute. Since hopper minecarts can collect drops through another block, I needed one of those to gather the items that would drop. Using some of the resources I'd collected over the past few days, I wanted to make a true enchanting table that would enable me to forge some endgame equipment. It was way too expensive to use for now, but would come in handy later. After enough microcrafting to make tech packs blush, I was finally able to craft the upgrade. The rest of the night was spent finishing the power system for the saw. It did take a while, but by the time the sun came up, everything was fully operational. True enchanting tables can receive XP cost discounts from nearby bookshelves up to a maximum of 30%. Thus, I added another 15 bookshelves to make 30 in total. Then, with a single right click, my trusty enchantment table was upgraded. Since true enchantment tables are so inordinately expensive, frequently costing tens of thousands of XP just to make singular pieces of god equipment, I would need a regular enchanting table to make a disenchanting table, which I could then use to rip good enchantments from pre-existing gear. In terms of new things, the true enchantment table was kind of useless in all honesty, since the only unique thing it could give me was mending. Like the lazy bastard I am, instead of crafting a table, it was time to hit the nether. After some searching, I was able to locate a library and quickly help myself to the valuable loot. While tidying up the spawner farm, the vermin soul horde began its invasion. Day 63 began with me trying to tame a little furry friend. Once I succeeded, I took him home and gave him a pleasant place to live in. I wanted to relocate the enchanting area to be slightly closer to my grinder because I'm a lazy American. Running back and forth from my base to the grinder was getting to be quite annoying, so it was time to make a branch of the Nether Highway. Once I completed my highway extension, I grabbed the materials I needed to challenge the next boss, the hideous Black Death. To deal with the plague, I would need cures, so I brought along some plague leeches. To summon him, I would need to call down lightning on a plague doctor, so I grabbed the lightning sword I looted from the Valkyrie temple. Once everything was ready, I headed towards the small remote village of no real importance and prepared to perform a gruesome ritual. While en route, I finally discovered why the deserts seemed so devoid of life. The sands were teeming with deadly sandworms. Their drops would be nice for making some unique items, but I didn't really see myself using them in the future, as I didn't exactly have meat hooks or the Fremen to guide me. After a long journey fraught with hazards, I finally arrived at the village. I took Antoinette's advice and ate some cake, then scouted out the location a little bit more. The area was flatter than Bill Maher's jokes and more bland too, so I knew I was in the perfect place to fight. I positioned myself on a roof and prepared for combat. Finally, after a grueling battle, I eliminated the Black Death, but his drops fell into a fire and were burnt. In frustration, I made battle with a plague rat, but missed more shots than Harvey Lee Oswald without the CIA. Unsatisfied, I fought another Black Death, and this time his drops were actually recoverable. This plague site's projectiles were really sick and surprisingly strong. However, we all know that nothing beats the raw power of an Onyx Greatsword except for /kill, and even that I'm not exactly sure of. Afterwards, I began the long trek back to base. I organized my inventory a little bit, then made some heart containers for later. Now that I had a disenchantment table and lots of levels, I wanted to complete my Onyx Greatsword's enchantments, and the best way to do that is by enchanting gold swords, disenchanting them, and then using the books in an anvil. I also named my sword because, well, why not? Long live the Brain Damage Empire. Then, well, it was leveling time. This was going to take a lot of XP. So much so, in fact, that I AFK'd the entirety of day 5. Today was April Fool's Day, so I was terrified as to what might happen. I picked up my new rat friend and exited the premises. On the way back, I found a wild hippogriff vibing on the hill. This could honestly be the break that I really needed to expand my discovered territories, so I quickly rode back to base to get the rabbit's feet that I needed for taming. The new rat that I tamed during the grinding session turned out to be a female, and my first rat was male, so you know what time it is. I popped the lantern in the cage and averted my eyes to let them take care of business. Afterwards, it was back to the hill to get the hippogriff. I wasn't sure whether just 2 rabbit's feet was enough, but I really hoped that it was. Sure enough, it worked. I now had the adoration of a flying friend. So I saddled him up and went for a ride back to base. Since he was no longer needed, I let my reindeer retire in peace and return to nature. This guy was going to need some armor, so I slapped together feathers with diamond horse armor from the nether to get hippogriff armor, custom made and ready to use. I also put a chest on him so he could support my hoarding problem. With nothing better to do, it was time to go out on an adventure. I wanted to see what lay beyond the frontier, to discover and conquer new lands. So, away we went. By the morning of day 7, I had explored up to the tip of the cape and was ready to cross the ocean. As I explored, I came across an end island with pearls. While there's an endermite spawner beneath the obsidian pillars and I could have farmed more pearls, I really didn't feel like dealing with that right now. I also found a siren nest which I promptly and brutally cleared out. Unfortunately, the ocean was rather boring. I had hoped to encounter a sea serpent but was utterly luckless in my endeavors. I did, however, mark some ocean monuments for the future in case I needed them. Eventually, I came upon some new land. At first, I thought it might be an island of sorts, but the dark oak trees told me that I had found a new continent. I did what any colonizer worth their salt does and immediately set to work fully exploiting the natural resources of the area. I also came upon this exposed dungeon, which held some interesting loot. There was nothing of particular value, but I'm never one to pass up free money. Just as I was about to start turning back towards base, it happened. I had found the den of a hideous cyclops. It was time to fight and whet my weapons against a worthy opponent. Nah, just kidding. The poor thing didn't even stand a chance. By this point, I was already too powerful. By the time I finished harvesting everything of value, it was deep into nighttime and I decided to start flying home. In a stroke of luck though, I found a village along the way. Unlike other villages though, this one was ruled over by a solar-fisted tyrant, a chief of the Barracoa. In exchange for having freed this town from hardship, I was allowed to take whatever I pleased from the village. Well, I wasn't really granted express permission necessarily, but I did kinda just kill the one guy who could have stopped me. Having looted to my heart's content, I began the long flight home. Flying at night in this mod pack is honestly truly something else. After a night of flying, I was finally back at base. The first thing that I did when I got home was, as always, to dump my entire inventory into my storage system. This only made the organizational issue worse, but like all of my long-term problems, that'd be a matter for future me to deal with and for present me to ignore. After doing that, I dug some deathworm eggs out of my inventory and hatched the little fellas. Off to the village, I have a bounty to claim. The reward on this wasn't really great, but again, I'm never one to pass up free stuff. At this stage in the game, I basically have to play Cooking Mama and run around my base to deal with errands like crafting, farm collection, and so on. This was quite menial, but the nice thing was that when everything was done, my worms had grown quite a bit. If you guys have any suggestions, please let me know. Currently, I want to name one Ouroboros, Devourer of the Cosmos, and the other one, Greg. My current pendant was quite nice, but I really wanted something that would carry me through the challenging battles ahead. This Wrath pendant was disgustingly good, since it granted both damage and defense buffs on a critical hit. Assuming I was constantly in combat, I'd effectively have a permanent +2 armor and damage buff. Unfortunately, this was quite expensive, but I was a prolific hoarder, so I knew I'd have at least a few of the materials. First up on the list was the crown. I located a village earlier that had no real purpose, so off I went to strip it clean of any useful resources. I love books, although since I'm a rotten player and thus illiterate, these bad boys would be going straight towards the efforts to restock my toilet paper. As Sun Tzu once said, keep the battle plan clean and your ass even cleaner. Finally, after extracting everything of value from the two local warlords, it was time to practice a little French revolutioning. Then I cleaned out the rest of the town. The local citizens were freed. I think so anyways. I suppose they can figure out the whole democracy thing themselves. As I escaped from the village, I took a look in my pockets, and to my delight, I had obtained a village lord's helmet. This was the most difficult ingredient right out of the way. After I got back to base, I sorted out my inventory and put away everything I didn't need, including these royalist guts. Then I searched for the other things I would need to craft the pendant. My worm friends had grown to be quite large now. This fella in particular was quite adventurous, having made the rounds of my base and taken damage from a source more elusive than Havana Syndrome. And here we had it, the Wrath Pendant. It had a decent modifier on it, and I wasn't really rich enough to reroll, so I kept it as it was. Eventually, I got around to taking down the automatic hemp farm. It had served its purpose in propelling me through the early game, but now I no longer needed it. This space that was cleared out would be very useful for expanding our base, so I was excited to have it. Now that this pendant had been acquired, I prepared to take down one of my foremost enemies, but first an expansion to the base. While I could have beckoned him to come fight on the surface, I felt honorable enough to give him a fighting chance on his home turf, and more importantly, a cheap on-site burial. So I sat and waited for the dawn to break and the showdown to commence. After a harrowing back and forth duel, the Wither Lord of the Nether had been slain. I thought that his death might bring some semblance of peace to my world, but as I heard the fury of a million voices crying out around me, I knew I had made a grave mistake. In fact, the Wither had been protecting this world from unspeakable horrors which made the hellish Nether even more dangerous than it had been. On the other hand, the Wither dropped quite a nice few items, and I like cool stuff, so his death wasn't all that bad for me. Once I cleaned up the mess that was my inventory, I made 2 flamers and set up an automatic permanent furnace. Then it was back to an enchantment table to do some renovations. I added this repair station area, which would make it so that I could simultaneously grind EXP and fix my broken equipment. By disenchanting some mob drops, I recovered quite a few valuable enchantments, some of which I couldn't even get through normal enchanting. And thus, having accomplished this journey's ultimate goal of killing the Wither, I was content to spend the rest of the day grinding XP. After all, there weren't any more dangers lurking in this world, were there?